Hello, and welcome back. Today is going to be our part 2 on our lecture series of South America. Today we're going to be going through specific regions within South America, looking at the variety of government and economies happening in this realm. So first of all, we're going to go ahead and talk about the political regions. In our last lecture, we talked about the cultural regions, which was looking at things like the Amerindian area in the west or the tropical plantation area in the east. Now we're going to be looking more in terms of governments, and we have it clustered into these different political regions. So we'll have the Caribbean North, the Andean West, Brazil, which we'll do last since it's just one country, although it is, of course, a very dominant player, not just in this realm, but on the world stage, and then the Southern Cone as well. Okay, so starting off on the Caribbean North, this is going to include the countries of Colombia here, Venezuela, and then Guyana, Suriname, and French Guiana. It should be noted that French Guiana actually is not an independent country. It is still controlled by France, so it would be a territory within South America. Okay, so historically, we very much had a tropical plantation economy after colonialism. Again, a majority of this area here would have been ruled by the Spanish, with the exception of these three right here. Guyana would have been controlled by the British, Suriname by the Dutch, and then French Guiana is still controlled by the French, although Venezuela and Colombia both would have been controlled by the Spanish. So all of these countries here have access to the Caribbean Sea, although it is interesting that Colombia has not developed as much its ports over on the Pacific Ocean as much as some of the other countries along the west coast of South America have. So even though French Guiana, Suriname, and Guyana still have some of that tropical plantation aspects, Colombia and Venezuela now have diversified their economies, and we have a lot of farming, a lot of mining, and a lot of ranching. We do have a very diversified landscape as well here. So we have the Guyana Highlands, which is going to be an area of higher elevation. We have Lake Maracaibo, which technically is not a lake. It actually does have an outlet to the ocean, but that's going to play a very important detail in this realm, especially in terms of oil reserves. The Llanos here is going to be a plainland area that is currently largely used again for oil drilling, but also has some ranching opportunity here. There is some flooding as it is along the banks of the Orinoco River. And then you have Angel Falls, which, fun fact, is the tallest waterfall in the world. Okay, so we'll go ahead and look off first at Colombia. So as I mentioned, Colombia has access both to the Caribbean Sea and the Pacific Ocean. There is less development in the Pacific Ocean in terms of port access. Bogota is the capital of Colombia, although Cali, which is on the western side, is still a major city, of course. So you'll see here in this picture here, again, Lake Maracaibo going to be a major source of oil reserves. And so there's a lot of oil and gas reserves. That's what these little barrel shapes are, right along the border between Venezuela and Colombia. And there has been definitely some border disputes around that. Colombia in general has had a lot of rebel groups in the internal workings of the country, which has been very stressful, to put it mildly, for the people living here. So one such rebel group was going to be FARC, which that stands for, the translation is the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, and they are one of the more high-profile, more powerful rebel groups within Colombia, is so much so that some other countries outside of Colombia actually recognize them as being their own entity. The United States does not. So FARC did actually start an area called FARClandia, which would have been this central area right south of Bogota here, that then would have been an insurgent state. So as we mentioned earlier, insurgent states are going to be when a rebel group takes over an area of a country and then attempts to make their own country within that. So insurgent states are different than failed states in that a failed state would have absolute anarchy and no type of government structure. Insurgent states do still have a government set up. They can have some social services, although they are definitely in opposition to the recognized government. In this case, Farklandia was not recognized by the United States or many other countries. And so this would have taken place in the 1990s and early 2000s. A lot of the conflicts within Colombia started in the 1970s, and large of this would have been widely around the drug trade, namely cocaine. So coca, which is a plant that grows natively in Colombia, as well as much of this realm, can be used to make cocaine. And the number one buyer of cocaine is going to be the United States. So there's been a very heavy involvement by the U.S. in Colombia, going kind of in both directions. So on the one hand, American consumers are buying cocaine, which then, encourages people to grow cocaine. But then the U.S. has the war on drugs, and they have given a lot of money to the Colombian government to fight this growing of cocaine. So the combination of the oil and gas, which of course is very lucrative, cocaine, which is very lucrative, and then you have a high number of people who don't have land access. So in Colombia, a very large amount of the land is owned by a very small amount of people. So you have a lot of people who are in desperate poverty who don't have much say in their land access. And so you have this very interesting unity between people who are in the oil industry versus the cocaine industry, and that they both want the government to make things easy for them. And they both often have a lot of land mutuality, I should say. So we've got coca is growing down here, which also is going to be an oil area. There's a lot of coca grown in here, which is going to also be an oil area. A few pockets up here as well. Right? And so they kind of team up together in trying to keep the government out of interfering with oil fields and cocaine growing operations. And a lot of the poorer people in Colombia feel that they have no choice but to grow cocaine versus, say, coffee, which is a major export for Colombia, as well as like cut flowers for like the florist industry, if you buy cut flowers at like a florist shop, because it is still a paying gig. There is still demand. Because again, people in the US and Brazil and Europe are still buying cocaine. So again, a large amount of U.S. involvement, and a lot of people fleeing Colombia because it is a very violent and dangerous in parts of Colombia. Venezuela, also very dependent on oil. Venezuela has a very large economy in terms of oil. They also had some iron mining and agriculture happening in higher elevations. When we look at our Central American lecture, we'll see how the different elevations has a big impact on what kind of plants and crops you would grow. And so in the 1970s, this was going really great for Venezuela. Again, lots of money coming in from oil. Some scientists estimate that Venezuela has the largest stash of oil reserves in the world. But then in the 1980s, oil prices dropped, and we had recessions, happening in much of the world based on this. Well, what happened is the Venezuelan government had been borrowing money based on these oil profits. And then when the oil profits didn't turn out so good with the price drop, there was a big foreign debt. And so this, of course, there was a huge amount of protests. People were like, whoa, how can we have so much oil and then suddenly almost go bankrupt, which they really did almost go bankrupt. And so you had a change in power starting in the late 1990s with Hugo Chavez. So Hugo Chavez is a very controversial figure. And so he was elected in 1998 and 2000. He died in 2013, so he was elected again, but he passed away before he was sworn in. And so many people consider him to be a problematic leader. Was in 1992, he was involved in an attempted coup on the Venezuelan government. But it also showed how there was this shift in a lot of Venezuelans being very upset with the wealthy elite ruling class. Again, because he did not come from the wealthy elite ruling class. He had been military beforehand. So very polarizing figure, but he did do a lot of work in Colombia, or not Colombia, Venezuela for many years. If we now go to the Andean West, which of course is going to be where the Andes Mountains are, on the western side of our continent. So now we're going to have much more high elevation regions. We're also going to have some desert regions here as well, as you mentioned, the Atacama Desert, because of that rain shadow effect. Remember, what's happening is as those parcels of clouds, those air, moves across a desert, the water gets squeegeed out of them, in effect. And so it is very common to have a desert on the opposite side of a mountain region. So the Atacama Desert is created because of the Andes Mountains. So here we'll have Ecuador, Peru, Bolivia, and Paraguay. Many folks in this region identify as indigenous. So I had talked about the Inca before. We'll talk about some other groups here as well. A lot of the economy here is going to be subsistence agriculture, so really growing only as much food to feed your own family, as well as mining. And of course, the conditions in mining here can be pretty poor working conditions. So this could be changing, the fact that they have a pretty weak economy in this region. It's the weakest economic region in South America. You have the highest rates of poverty here. However, because we have so much minerals, this could be changing. There have also been some changes in the political front, especially since we have a rise in socialist movements. So Bolivia elected Evo Morales in 2006. He's estimated to be the first Amerindian. He is Amarian. I'm pronouncing it wrong, I think. He's believed to be the first indigenous person to be the president of Bolivia. And he was running on the socialist ticket. And so within Bolivia, it is a landlocked country, which is, of course, problematic in terms of trade. Bolivia used to have access to the Pacific Ocean, but they lost that in the war with Chile in the 1800s. They do currently have an agreement with Chile to allow port access, but of course that is, at the mercy of another country. So yeah, the Aymara is the group that Evo Morales is a member of, and so they are a very large indigenous group here. So we have the Aymara, and we have the Inca, and of course many other indigenous groups here. And more than half of the population identifies as indigenous or Amerindian in this region. There is a big tension between the indigenous Bolivians and the Bolivians of European descent. In fact, some people joke that Bolivia has two capitals, and that is kind of true. So, for example, if you look at some older textbooks, they'll label La Paz as the capital of Bolivia, but if you were to Google it or Wikipedia or whatever, it would say Sucre is the capital of Bolivia. And a lot of this is based on how different government chapters have been divided. And so if we look at the country of Bolivia, do I have a picture here? I do. So if you were to split the country of Bolivia in half, and so you can see there's two stars, La Paz and Sucre, both get stars. Which one's the capital, right? If you were to divide this kind of in half, the more mountainous, high elevation region in the west is much more going to have an indigenous majority. Again, these highlands are going to be not as good for agriculture, again, more of the subsistence agriculture and mining. And then if you look over in the eastern side, you're going to have a much higher group of people who either identify as mestizo, meaning they are multiracial, or of being a European descent. And so there was a lot of push of, La Paz being in the more indigenous focused part of the country. And Sucre is more on the border. It's still technically in the highland area. Some people want to move the capital to Santa Cruz, which is very much in the more European descendant area. And so it kind of got split. Like you have the Supreme Court is going to be in Sucre, but you have like some of the administrative headquarters are going to be in La Paz. And so we have the government bodies are in two different cities. Okay, so sometimes you have the constitutional capital is what Sucre is called. Again, that's where the Supreme Court is, versus some of the other administrative branches are going to be in La Paz. And so that's just indicative of the tensions in between the indigenous Bolivians and the Bolivians of European descent. We definitely see, again, a rise of the Socialist Party. So these women here are coming back from a meeting of the socialist government group, which is what Evo Morales, the former president, he's not currently president, was running on that party. Okay, as I mentioned before, we have a very high amount of natural resources here. So silver was the big one that a lot of European colonial powers were interested in. We also have natural gas, oil, and zinc, which not only is good for you as a vitamin, but also has a lot of industrial properties as well. You can overdose on zinc, so don't take too much. I should say that. Talk to your medical professional before taking any zinc. Let's go ahead and talk about the southern cone. So this is going to be the wealthiest region of South America, largely thanks to its ties to trade with Europe. Okay, this is going to be a very urbanized area. In fact, if you look at, say, for example, Argentina has more people living in cities than we see in Western Europe, which we talked about being very urbanized than we see in the United States. And so a lot of people here are living in cities and moving away from the more rural agriculture areas. So we're going to have Chile, Argentina, and Uruguay. And the major feature of this region here is going to be Mercosur, sometimes called Mercosul if you are speaking Portuguese versus Spanish. So Mercosur is the trade association for this region. It is the second largest in the Americas, NAFTA being a bit larger, although NAFTA's things have been changing for NAFTA. So Mercosur is going to be a trade organization specifically for South America. It has 4 full member countries as of 2020, and then there are 7 associated members, so people who don't have the same status but are still allowed to do some work in terms of, involvement with trade deals. Venezuela did have their membership suspended, and then New Zealand and Mexico are observer member status. It is also interesting noting, we mentioned the Falkland Islands. Earlier, you may have heard of the Falkland Wars in the 1980s, and it's highlighted yellow here because Argentina does claim it, although it is still UK controls it. So again, that has been a sticking point between Argentina and the United Kingdom, who controls those islands. 90% of the citizens here are of European descent, and so you have much fewer folks of Amerindian descent or of African descent either. Remember, we mentioned in last week's lecture, talking about because of the transatlantic slave trade, we have a very, very high number of people of African descent living especially in Brazil and parts of that Caribbean north as well. Also, a lot of people of South Asian descent as well. Again, people who were brought to this continent in terms of helping with labor forces, often against their will. So again, looking at Argentina has an interesting feature called the Pampa. So this word means plain, and this is going to be like it sounds, a wide open plain. And so this is going to be along the eastern coast. So again, looking at our lovely map here. Okay, so the Pampas is going to be on the eastern coast, right? Patagonia, which you may have heard of, is going to be some more highlands. And so, yeah, it's a very large country, of course. Second largest, only second to Brazil on this realm. All right, so the Pampa is going to be the area that is most populated. It has an economy of meat and grain. Again, the nice thing about open plains is you can have agriculture there. Okay, so a lot of Europe gets their food from this area. Again, we have a very strong tie to Europe in this region here in terms of again, trade relations. We also still have a lot of raw materials. So again, a lot of those minerals harvested in the interior portion of Argentina, and then the urban areas on the outside along the coasts are then going to process them. Okay, so we again still have the idea of core and periphery, where you have some parts are going to have more power, both economically and politically, and other parts are going to have to do more of the manual labor. This has been an issue for Argentina. So Argentina historically used to be one of the richest countries in the world. Of course, if you are familiar with the musical Evita, or the story of Eva Perón, there was a huge inequity of who had wealth and who didn't, right? And so a lot of this was going to be economic mismanagement and just things kind of just falling apart politically. a lot of political corruption. And so there's a concern, is it's a very large country, but you have some provinces that are very highly populated, so they're larger in terms of population, and then some provinces that have very low numbers of population. And so the issue is that you have some provinces are being given more power in the government than others. And so some provinces feel overlooked. And so there's been concerns about political corruptions and uprisings and so on and so forth. Again, as I mentioned, Argentina has a very highly populated. In 2016, it was like something like 90% of the population lived in cities, and that's extremely high. One of the highest in the world. And of course, you can't talk about South America without talking about Brazil, which is going to be the largest country here. It's got a population of over 210 million as of 2020. And we mentioned in last week's lecture that Brazil is known for having a very multiracial society. So in 2010, you had about 47% people identified as being white or European descent, and 50% would have identified as multiracial. However, that doesn't mean that Brazil has no race problem, right? So Brazil actually is estimated that Brazil has the second highest percent of or number of people of African descent next to Nigeria. So it has a very large, again, because of the transatlantic slave trade, a lot of people brought to South America to work on plantations, and their descendants still live there today. But even though they have a very multiracial society, they do still have race issues. And so people who are darker skinned are going to have less opportunities in government and in jobs and so on and so forth. Brazil's economy is one of the top 10 in the world. I saw the number 9 is I think the last number I looked up as of 2010. He's a member of the BRICS, which is going to be, again, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, are those major emerging world markets. Part of Brazil's powerhouse is going to be it has aspects that are both agricultural and minerals. So, for example, massive amounts of iron ore, and you need iron ore in order to make steel, and steel is going to be a major component of pretty much any industrial effort. And so Brazil is a major exporter of iron ore. Most of their exports go to China, but the U.S. still takes a pretty big chunk too. I think 22% or something goes to China, and then like 12% goes to U.S. in terms of export, overall exports. So iron ore is going to be a big one. Again, steel is very important. Their leading agricultural crops is soybeans. So if you like tofu, a lot of people also don't know that soybeans can be incorporated to feed livestock as well. So yes, we think about soybeans being for, soy milk and edamame and tofu, but it also can be fed to pigs and cattle as well. Beef is also a major export for Brazil, as coffee. Rubber did have a bit of time in Brazil as well, not as much so now, but there was a time where rubber did have natural rubber, which is extracted from trees, did have a feature in Brazil's economy. Less so now, though. So when we look at the vast size of Brazil, we have to talk about the Amazon Basin, right? Because the majority of the Amazon Basin occurs in central Brazil. So you can see here, we're looking at Brazil, a very large chunk of the northwestern portion is all going to be tropical rainforest. Now, an interesting thing about the tropical rainforest, we all think about the rainforest as being very lush and full of amazing biodiversity and animal plants, but the soil in the rainforest is actually not good, right? The soil is not good because all of the nutrients is stored in those plants and animals. And if you cut all the trees down, then there's nothing to replenish your soil because it rains so much here. Again, the rainforest. Because it rains so much, all that rain just washes the nutrients out of the soil. So soil in the rainforest is actually really not good. Okay. So within the Amazon Basin, we actually have a very low population density. There are lots of small, isolated Amerindian tribes, some of whom are actually highly protected because they have been so isolated from other groups that they don't have immunity to potential diseases. So there are parts of the Amazon that you cannot go to. But there's a lot of concern because again, soybeans, beef, all these things require land. And so Brazil is more and more being encroached, or I should say the Amazon rainforest is being more and more encroached upon in something called the growth pole concept. And this idea is that once you put one road in, well, then you might as well put in 2 roads. If you're going to have 2 roads, you might as well have 4, And so it's kind of idea of once you've started development in an area, it really rapidly and easily multiplies. Because kind of like, once one person started, then everyone's going to go ahead and, well, they built a road, so why can't I? And so you do have, if you look at satellite maps, you can see like, there'll be 1 road through here, and then a bunch more start to branch off in little subdivision areas. And so we see that happening throughout the Amazon basin. Of course, there has been a lot of news coverage about the huge amount of fires they've been having in the Amazon basin. The current president of Brazil, Bolsonaro, is again a very controversial figure. He is known for having some pretty awful statements about the LGBT community and being extremely conservative. But again, his comments on the LGBT community are really hurtful and really bad. So Brazil's economy is growing massively. Again, it's one of the top 10 in the world. It's part of this BRICS community that's very much growing and growing and growing. And so the push into the Amazon is happening more and more and more. To comparison, if we compare again that Amazon basin being fed by the Amazon, next up that we have the Cerrado, and the Cerrado is going to be a savanna. And savanna is much more going to be open plain. It has a few spotted trees here and there, so less of that lush, thick forest type atmosphere. Okay. There's also a lot of concern with the autonomy for the indigenous peoples living here. I had mentioned before in our dams and water lecture how you have a lot of corporations coming here and building like the Belamonte Dam. And coming in and saying, well, you don't have a piece of paper that says you own this land, therefore I'm going to take it. And so a lot of like, how do these indigenous groups, quote unquote, prove that the land belongs to them historically and that it's their and their ancestral land, was as more and more corporations and lumbering. So again, a lot of pushes for lumber operations, a lot of big trees make lovely wood, lovely hardwood floors or whatnot, And so there's a lot more pressure on the Amazon. Of course, the Amazon is vastly not just, human beings living here, but the biodiversity of the animals and plants. And there's animals and plants found here that are not found anywhere else in the world. So something that Brazil did to kind of get a jump start on this encroachment into the Amazon basin is they create a forward capital, which we had mentioned in our North Africa lecture. So a forward capital is when a country moves their capital city to a new location in order to exert power on another area. So when we were in our North Africa, Southwest Asia lecture and then our South Asian lecture, we saw this in terms of Pakistan moving their capital in order to try to get access to closer to a border of another state, another country. In this case, it was we were moving from Rio de Janeiro. So Rio de Janeiro is not the capital of Brazil, neither is Sao Paulo, but Brasilia, which is much more in the interior, is the current capital of Brazil. And this was very much of like being on the coast. Yeah, we get it. You got a nice port city, but there's less access to exerting power onto the interior. And again, if we're trying to get into the interior, is to have more cattle ranching and more soy operations. And so the movement of Brazil the capital farther into the interior is going to be an example of that forward capital. Okay, so trying to expand more power and more development into Brazil's interior Amazon basin. Okay. If you are a sports fan, you may be aware that Brazil has an amazing sports culture, right? Lots of different international sports have been hosted here. So, again, football, of course, or soccer for the United States. So 2013, 2014, a lot of work with FIFA. And then, of course, the Summer Olympics in 2016. This photo here is actually going to be the semifinals in men's football between Brazil and Honduras, and again in Rio de Janeiro. So there's been a lot of international attention on the sports arena. However, this has not been without a lot of tension because all three of these events had numerous protests. So the first two protests, or I should say, 2013 was much more about economy. 2014, 2016 were each about different presidents. There was a change in presidents between them. The 2014 president actually had been impeached, and the 2016 president was her interim. And so a lot of these protests around the president, finances. The Olympics has very strong anti-protest rules. The Olympics are supposed to be neutral and non-political, which is kind of a moot point because every single Olympics has had protesters, or every single Olympics has had people, countries refusing to participate, or individual athletes making statements. But the Olympics actually does officially have a very strong anti-protesting statement because it's supposed to be about the sports and not about the politics, but it's kind of hard to separate that sometimes. So a lot of controversy is that in order to build all these massive, beautiful, gorgeous stadiums and facilities, number one, that's a lot of money. Number two, you got to move a lot of people. So Brazil, again, has a very large divide between the haves and the have-nots. If you look at that, the model, the Latin American city model we saw in the last lecture, the idea of the favelas and the barrios, very much happening in Brazil. So you have a lot of those squatter settlements on the periphery of Brazilian cities where people are living in very high poverty, again, making homes out of whatever they can scramble. Favela is much more the term used in Brazil. And so a lot of people are saying, how is it that we can have these giant multi-million-dollar Olympic facilities bring in all these tourists, which then clogs your transit systems and raises the cost of food and cost of, your bus pass and whatnot, as we bring more and more and more people into your city, while you have a lot of people in your city who are, just struggling to survive. So a lot of international attention. And I think I might have some videos I can post of this. A lot of people were forcibly moved from their homes and their homes bulldozed in order to make room for stadiums. This is not unique to Brazil, I should say. This happens all over the world. This is not unique to Brazil. It's just more recent years. Again, 2016, not that long ago. So it's much more on our modern, our cultural wavelength, I guess, because it's more in more recent years, but this is not in any way unique to Brazil. Okay, that is all I have for you. Thank you so much, and I'll see you next time. Bye.